Good evening. It's Wednesday, the 25th of May. I'm Reagan King, and you're watching Behind the Headlines. I'm joined in the absence of my normal co-host, Simon Barrett. He's away sunning himself somewhere, by our good friend, Alistair Scott. I'm confident, Alistair, that you'll have a lot to bring to the program this evening.
Great to be here with you.
Always a pleasure. Now, we're in a chaotic world. That's not news to you. There's nothing that we're having to announce in regard to that. You see it every day. The headlines are very evident. There's war, there's rumors of wars, there's famine. We were talking about that just yesterday. Yeah. There's so much devastation, so much corruption. And in the fog of all of this, it is easy to miss some important stories. Last week, I saw a particular article in The Spectator asking why it is essentially that the West seems to very often ignore the extreme persecution of Christians in Nigeria. Maybe you are from Nigeria and you're watching this evening, and maybe this is something you've noticed. We want to hear from you. Why does the West ignore the persecution of Christians in Nigeria? Maybe you think the West doesn't ignore the persecution of Christians in Nigeria. Please do send in your thoughts, your ideas, and anything that you think might be relevant to this question. Now, Alistair, persecution is nothing new.
No.
Tell us a little bit about why it is that Christians actually can and probably should expect to experience persecution in general.
Well, it's biblically true that, as the Lord said, that we can expect trials in the world, but He has overcome the world. So there is no doubt for our faith we have to carry our cross and be very aware that there are enemies out there, spiritual enemies. I mean, not talking about physical enemies, because it's not with that we wrestle against flesh and blood, but it's always a spiritual battle. And as believers, we some people call us extreme because we believe Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and there's no other way to the Father, no other way to paradise, to heaven, except through Jesus. And that comes against most religions. And most religions want to believe, we don't have to name any names, but there's several ways to get there. Mm-hmm. So, we are expecting it because we're warned about it. We're told what will happen in the end times. But we know that God's grace, He graces us to be strong enough in Him, not in our own strength, but, to be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. So it's happening around the world. In some of the nations that I work in some of the Islamic nations in Asia, and you see the height of persecution that comes against those who believe. We are finding it fairly easy, although it's challenging in the Western world, but it's getting tougher and tougher, as we know, because a lot of the times we're belittled because of what we believe, and people, academics think, how can you believe in something you can't see? Well, we believe because we believe what the Word of God says, and we have our encounters with Him. So persecution is part of our lives, and some of our brothers are receiving far more persecution than we do. But I stand with them, I pray for them, I work with a lot of them, and it's exciting, it's an adventure, but you always know that God is with us and God is for us. So there's a kind of extreme covering that comes, which is spiritual, to help us in those areas.
In the Gospel of John, chapter 15, Jesus says that we should actually realize if the world hates us, and when the world hates us, really, we should remember that it hated Christ first.
Exactly.
And so elsewhere in the letters, we also are reminded that we should not think that we're alone in our suffering. And sometimes, even in this relative ease of which you speak that we have in the West, though, there's that mental fatigue of condescension and being patronized for the faith that we have at times. We can fall into this thinking that we're the ones who have it bad or that we're alone, but we're reminded that our brothers elsewhere in the world are going through the same thing and even worse. Yeah. I have had the privilege of knowing and being friends with many Nigerian believers who have found themselves here in the UK. I know several in Nigeria itself in various spots. And truly, when we think of a country like Nigeria, massive populous, it's massive land area, has amazing resources naturally. It was a Commonwealth, and it is a Commonwealth country.
It is, yeah.
And you can look at it and think that there's a lot that's going for Nigeria. There's a lot of beauty there. There's a lot of good there. There's a very significant Christian population. Well, more than half of the population in Nigeria professes to follow Christ. And many of those friends that I've mentioned are extremely ardent and sincere believers, very firm in their faith, very passionate for the gospel, for which we rejoice. In this environment, however, Nigeria finds itself in a situation where Christians are extremely persecuted. And despite having a significant Christian population, particularly in the north of Nigeria, Christians can and are being killed and slaughtered on a routine basis. This isn't just isolated moments. This isn't just one area of, okay, we need to keep an eye on this. In Nigeria, between 2020 and 2021, there were more Christians who died for their faith than in any other part of the world combined.
It's frightening, isn't it? Because it's one of the, you talked about West Africa. I work in East Africa, in a place like Kenya and Uganda particularly. And it's funny how things have changed even on the east side, where there used to be a very, very strong majority of Christianity. But in the last few years, when I'm going back, you see more and more of the Islamic mosques and so on being built. And most are absolutely easy, not looking for problems. But places like Nigeria, when I was looking at the statistics, I've been aware of how awful it is over the last, not just recently, but over several decades. There have been terrorist attacks and schools where the Christian schools and particularly the girls were kidnapped and forced to be husbands to the Islamic people and so on. And it hardly gets any recognition or reporting on any of the TV or radio. I mean, that's why it's so great. I was thinking, just as I was driving here today, this evening, I was thinking, isn't it nice that we're going to be talking about something which hasn't been headline news in this country, because we've been so much into Partygate and everything else for the last few months. But this is something that should be reported. And I think, it's our responsibility in a way. And thank goodness for people like Revelation TV to make these things known and make even the Christians aware that we should be praying for our brothers. It talks about it in the book of Corinthians. If one suffers, we all suffer. If one is honored, we all rejoice together. But I think we tend to forget these brothers in lands where they're very persecuted. Pakistan, where I work, I mean, I'm so aware of it, and yet when I tell people what I see when I'm there, they almost, gaga eyes at me because they can't believe this is really happening. But it is, and it's very important for us to let people know what's happening in Nigeria. I know we're going to focus on that mainly today, and get our brothers and sisters in the Western world to be praying for our brothers and sisters in those areas where persecution is far greater than we are receiving in the Western world.
Absolutely. Now, I have here the top 10 of the World Watch List 2022, the rankings of most persecuted nations. There's Afghanistan, no surprise there. It's the most dangerous place to be a Christian. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the most deadly place in terms of the statistics. But it's the most dangerous and probably would be the most deadly of Christians were as open and vocal as they would be in Nigeria. North Korea, Somalia, Libya, Yemen in number 5, Eritrea number 6, and Nigeria comes in at number 7, just before Pakistan at number 8, which you were just mentioning. Iran is number 9.
Surprising.
And then India is at number 10. But you look there, and we actually have 2 Commonwealth nations that are in the top 10 most persecuted places for Christians. It just beggars belief in some ways. We go now to this news report. This is from 2020. We will be dealing with some of the events that have led to us having this program this evening. But just to set this in some historical context, this has been going on for a significant amount of time. Here's a very helpful overview from our good friends at CBN.
After losing ground in Syria and Iraq, the top general of U.S. Special Operations Command in Africa is warning that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other Islamic terror groups are now trying to take over parts of the continent's most populous nation. Major General Dagvin Anderson says Muslim terrorists have set their sights on Nigeria's southern and northwestern regions, and the U.S. is now sharing specific intelligence with the country.
So this intelligence sharing is absolutely vital, and we stay fully engaged with the government of Nigeria to provide them an understanding of what these terrorists are doing.
Their goal? Eventually turn Nigeria into a Muslim country and force Christians, who make up half the country's population, to either leave or convert.
Christians are in the eye of the target, and they're coming after them.
And the numbers are staggering. August 6th, Muslims stormed 4 remote Christian villages in Kaduna State, killing 22 villagers. July 24th, 21 dead, scores injured, and several Christian homes destroyed by militants. July 19th, 19 people killed when assailants armed with guns and machetes attacked a wedding reception. And the list goes on. Leading human rights groups say what's going on in Nigeria is a genocide.
If you look at what's happened on the last 20 years, George, it's just massive number of attacks against Christians. Look, 50 to 70,000 have been murdered.
For years, the main terror group was Boko Haram, which seeks to overthrow the government here and create an Islamic state.
They go after Christians and moderate Muslims. They push a hard-line Muslim agenda. It is their intention to establish a caliphate and to just rid all of Nigeria and West Africa of any Western influence whatsoever.
Now, there's a new actor on the scene. In Nigeria's so-called Middle Belt region, where the Muslim North meets the Christian South, a terror group made up of Muslim Fulani herders are killing thousands of Christians. More than 1,400 Christians were hacked to death in just the first 7 months of 2020 by Fulani herders.
Unfortunately, the secular media are quite often biased and trying to present this as a tribal conflict rather than religious.
Nigeria's president, a Muslim, has so far done very little to stop the bloodshed. His police and army are also mostly made up of Muslims.
The attackers are never captured. They are not prosecuted. The security services respond very slowly. A full day can go on with attacks happening and no security shows up. And frequently, the government officials will provide cover.
Helpless and vulnerable to almost daily attacks, leading Catholic bishops are now urging Nigerian Christians to defend themselves. Human rights groups are asking the White House to appoint a special envoy to help end the persecution of Christians in Nigeria.
Unless the world takes note and puts pressure, economic pressure, sanctions, visa bans on the officials who are responsible for this travesty and for not reining in the terror, then Nigeria will continue to be a bloodbath.
Meanwhile, King's Group is helping more than 3,000 Christians who lost their businesses, homes, farms, or land to Boko Haram and Fulani militant attacks. International Christian Concern has created communal farms to give victims the opportunity to rebuild their lives.
When they get back to work, the family is fed, they have a future, the kids can go back to school. It's a restoration of hope. It really is. And it's much more than just economics. It's the whole community. It's all the parts of life, the emotional, the physical, the mental. It means a lot to them.
George Thomas, CBN News.
Very thankful for that insightful clip from CBN. Now, we do have some emails and texts. We are live, we are interactive. Joyce makes the comment, maybe Christians in the West take their freedom of speech, worship, and general freedom for granted and don't realize that people suffer for their faith in other parts of the world. We need to thank God for what we have and be grateful. What do you think about that?
I agree with her in many ways, but I think also we have to pray to God that we do have an open door for our faith. and let's pray that that door remains open. And I certainly agree with you completely that there are certain nations where there is so much persecution. We should be so pleased and thankful that we do have our freedom to share our faith, freedom to speak. I know it's getting more and more difficult to speak anything that doesn't flow with the general global thinking, but we still are able to go out and share our faith, talk to people without expecting major returns. We do see some terrorist attacks, but they tend to be generally against our nation, not specifically against us as believers. So.
Here's another from an anonymous individual. Hi guys, I notice how quickly the media reports on Islamophobia, but hardly anything about full-scale persecution of Christians worldwide. And I think that there's a degree of truth to that. We see a lot of talk about hate crimes and even calling into question, if I was to go and have a conversation or debate with some Muslims on a dawah stand or something, if I said something that they deemed offensive, that could cause a problem. I could be, even just with disagreeing, maybe not even strongly expressing that disagreement, I could be deemed, with the views I express, guilty of Islamophobia. But very often and increasingly when I see a lot of this news reported, if it's reported, there seems to be a glossing over of the source of it. We are, Alistair, talking about Islamic terrorism here, are we not?
Absolutely. I mean, what we're looking at, particularly we're going to be looking at Nigeria, but around the world, it is it's Islamic terrorism, as you say. And very often when the attack is specifically against a Christian village or whatever, they kind of drop that side of it. It just tends to be like this is an attack on innocent people, but they don't actually bring out the fact that it is actually against Christian communities. I know I've seen this happen in Pakistan a lot, where the communities get attacked and no one mentions it. You know, they talk about it as being a strange terrorist attack, a strange tribal attack, but it's actually very much focused on because you're a Christian, nothing else. It's nothing to do with tribe, race, or anything else.
Now there are some terror cell groups that are operating in Nigeria. Yeah. And if we look at the reports, we can pretty well distinguish three separate entities that are primarily responsible for this intense persecution of Christians in Nigeria. There's Boko Haram, which many will doubtless be familiar with. There's also a split group, a group that went away from Boko Haram in about 2016, and they identify as Islamic State's West Africa province. So there's Boko Haram, and there was a slight divergence of ideology, and essentially it's Islamic State, ISIS in West Africa. And then we have quite a few reports that seem to be centered around, the news speaks of them in mainstream media as Fulani herdsmen. But they are Islamic. They are driven by radical Islamic ideology. So Boko Haram, Islamic State, and these Fulani herdsmen seem to be primarily responsible. Incidentally, the president of Nigeria at the moment is from the Fulani tribe and is himself a Muslim, and many have been disappointed with what seems to be a lack of willingness to confront the issue of Islamic terror in the strongest possible terms. Now, how are Christians persecuted in Nigeria is an important question, because there may be some viewers who think, well, I thought Nigeria was a relatively safe place, and as I mentioned earlier, I know many Nigerian Christians, and you would think, well, it seems to be filled with Christians, so what's the issue? The persecution facing Christians in Nigeria is extreme. It's brutally violent. We see churches, whole church buildings that are completely razed to the ground, burned with people inside of them. We read of whole villages, small villages where most of the people there will identify as Christians, where people are massacred. Tens of people. You know, we saw the devastating news from Texas, this mass shooting, multiple children and a teacher killed. I believe the figure was about 20, close to 20. But I will read of reports on a very regular, almost weekly basis of villages of 80 to 100 or more people killed in Nigeria, and very little, if anything, is actually said about this in the immediate instance on, say, BBC or any of the mainstream news.
It really doesn't make any sense at all, does it? Because as you say, if something happens in the States or in Europe, it's immediately probably number one or number two on the news points in the TV. And yet, as you say, there are hundreds and thousands getting slaughtered in Nigeria alone, but you can look at other nations and see similar numbers. And it doesn't even get a mention. Even if you look through a newspaper, it's going to be a little article in a middle page somewhere, which you could easily miss. And yet the slaughter that happens, I mean, it's absolute, it's evil what is going on, and it needs to be made known in the world. And it's, as I said earlier, it's often made out to be nothing to do with Islam against Christianity and so on. It's just sort of this little article which will talk about many people being killed in some kind of dispute. But the reality is it's happening daily. Places.
Well, let's have a look at some of the recent attacks. We can go back. We'll start. Let's start with June of 2020. Insurgents were reported to have killed around 81 civilians in Fellow village. 13th of June, insurgents attacked Manguno town, killing at least 38 civilians, targeting the humanitarian hub located in the town. Of all the self-defeating things to do to target a humanitarian hub. 2nd of July 2020, shots fired at UN Humanitarian Air Service a flight in Damasak, Borno State. 22nd of July 2025, aid workers, including staff from Action Against Hunger, the International Rescue Committee, ACTED and Reach Initiative, and the Borno State Emergency Management Agency, were executed by Islamic State. Now, these are actually statistics. You can find these on the government travel advisory in relation to Nigeria and terrorism in Nigeria. Yeah. What's interesting is they're not actually specifying, this is direct quote, they're not specifying that many of these are Christians.
Yeah, exactly. Most of them are Christian attacks on Christian communities, and it's not being mentioned at all. Okay, I know one or two of them are about aid workers, but they're Christian aid workers. Yeah. I knew one of the people who was actually killed in one of those attacks, and you know, they were out there doing great work, and then they got basically kidnapped, and then one of them was shot. So it's it's a terrible thing, but it needs to be made known that it is a major attack from Islamic terrorists, extremists, and it's not the general Islamic people, it's the extremists against Christianity, against Christian groups.
November 2020, 70 civilians were killed and others wounded and abducted in Borno State. 4th of December 2021, Islamic State in West Africa fired 4 rockets into one city where a civilian was killed. Some of the rockets landed within 2 kilometers of the airport. On 23rd of December of 2021, a number of long-range rockets were fired again into the same city. Some were reported to have landed close to the airport. A number of civilian casualties. In April of this year, Islamic State West Africa claimed 2 improvised explosive device attacks in Awari and Jalingo, Taraba State, and in May claimed an attack against a military facility in Jalingo. So that's all with aid workers and humanitarian type hubs, and we saw a few villages there that were, as you said, primarily Christian. Their methods of attack: coordinated armed assaults, rocket attacks, assassinations, kidnapping. Similarly, I knew a man a few years ago, about 2017, who was part of a medical mission. I believe it was dentistry, and they were kidnapped. He managed to hide and escape, but the people he was with, many of them were kidnapped, and one man who had dedicated so many years of his life to going back and forth to Nigeria for this dentistry work was killed. Just extremely tragic. Use of military uniforms and vehicles being used as a tactic to get close to intended targets, setting up fake roadblocks and security checkpoints where people are then accosted. There's illegal vehicle checkpoints on major supply and commercial routes in northern Nigeria, and then beyond that, the direct and intentional slaughter of Christians. March 24th in Kaduna State, at least 50 Christians were murdered, and a Catholic priest was abducted. And then in another attack, 100 kidnapped believers taken captive in Giwa County, seized in the middle of the night. At the same time, radical Fulani terrorists burned houses and a church and slaughtered other people's animals.
I mean, when you look at those numbers, they're huge numbers of people being slaughtered, and why is that not being reported? You know, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be reporting when you've had major incidents in the States or in Europe, but these things should not be ignored, because these are human beings just as we are.
We have a text message here. I became a Christian from the Zoroastrian faith in January of 1973. I received a lot of misunderstanding and some ridicule from family members, but nothing on the scale my brothers and sisters elsewhere in the world suffer. God bless you, and praise God for your testimony and for your endurance in that. And I think it is helpful, Alistair. I struggle when I hear some of the complaints among Christians in the UK, because we do, as you've already said, have it fairly easy.
Fairly easy, yeah.
And I see when some people, they'll be offended, or someone will say something mean, that they'll get a mean comment on their Facebook post or their Twitter post. Someone insults them, and there are some who it shakes their faith. Just a mean word, a mean message will shake their faith. But here we have people who they're having people, family members, friends massacred, and yet still they persist.
They still remain in their faith, don't they? And this is the thing, you do tend to see how the more the persecution is, the greater the faith. And I know from many testimonies I've had from people who are living in Iran, for instance, where there's a lot of persecution. When you talk to the Christians, they say, don't pray to God to stop the persecution, but pray to God that He continues to give us the strength and the grace to come through and continue to share our faith. Because I think it's in the comfort zone that it's more easy to take offense. I mean, you know, we're talking about people being offended because somebody said something in the street, but it happens in the church. You know, a message is preached and suddenly somebody takes offense because they think it's aimed at them. Instead of realizing it's the conviction of the Holy Spirit. It's, you said something that's offended me, I'm not going to come back to church. Or I'm going to find somewhere else to go. So you can see that the levels are so different. I mean, I know this it's one of the missions I have in my heart is to take Christians over to somewhere like Pakistan or Uganda or Nigeria. I don't have many contacts in Nigeria, but I do have friends working there. And let them see for themselves, because you know, when people talk about poverty as well, and I'm not belittling poverty, I know it exists, but go to somewhere where they really don't even know if they can have a piece of bread for the next day, and then you realize how well we're looked after in the Western world. I'm not saying that some people do not struggle.
No, it's true.
But it's a completely different level. That's what it is. It's a different level to what you see when you go into some of these nations where truly Christians are being persecuted, and their faith is so strong, and they're so easily joyful. You know, it always amazed me when I'd go into Pakistan and you could give somebody a plastic bottle that you had your drink in, and they'd be so pleased, and they would make it into something. They'd turn it into a little car or a rocket or something, and you think, wow, that's how we should all be.
Absolutely. Civil unrest has been sparked in Nigeria over this persecution just in the past couple of weeks. I did not watch the video footage, as I did not desire that to be in my head, but there's video footage, there was audio recordings, that there were eyewitness reports of a 19-year-old student, Deborah Samuel, who was a Christian in one of the northern states, who was stoned, flogged, and then burned to death by an extremist mob who took offense when she was asked how she passed her exams and replied, Jesus, refusing to retract her statement. People said, you shouldn't, don't say that, you shouldn't say that in the WhatsApp group. Well, she refused to retract her statement and she received some threats. She then responded in the course WhatsApp group, referring to what seems to have been a double standard in the WhatsApp group that saw many Muslims posting religious messages unchecked, without anyone saying, you need to remove this. She says, Holy Ghost fire, nothing will happen to me. Is it by force that you guys will always be sending this religious stuff in this group? The group wasn't created for that, but rather as a notice on tests, assignments, exams, etc., not these nonsense religious posts. Now, I then was thinking, okay, well, what happened? Where's the offense? This is just making a point, you know? But then she is effectively lynched because of blasphemy.
Yeah.
Shocking.
And all she's doing is expressing what she believes, and as you say, horrific death. It's not just, it's unbelievable.
I was able, Alistair, to have some time with Pastor Ade Amuba, who is the co-founder of Christian Concern, yesterday, and I was able to ask him his thoughts on this particular circumstance and some of the persecution that is rife throughout Nigeria. Here is Pastor Ade. I'm joined by Pastor Ade Amuba, who is the co-founder of Christian Concern. Pastor Ade, it's great to have you on the program.
Good to be with you. It's good to be here.
Tell us a little bit about the general context of Christianity in Nigeria, and tell us how the recent stories concerning persecution, especially this tragic martyrdom really of Deborah Samuel, how we can and should be praying into this situation.
Well, I will start by saying I give thanks to God for Christianity in Nigeria, for the many who God used to bring the gospel to Nigeria, to the villages where my grandfather was. They were not religious, but the gospel got to them. And it was from countries like the United Kingdom. And they embraced Christ. And some of those missionaries from there, some of them died bringing the gospel across the seas because they believed so much in it. They were bold. They almost wore a death sentence across their necks when they crossed over to bring the gospel. And with it, so much love. It was the gospel of the kingdom. It was holistic. It was salvation, but it was also more. And I'm grateful that that was passed to my grandfather, grandmother, passed to my parents, passed to me, and now I'm passing it to my children. So to start, I give thanks to God for those who brought Christianity to Nigeria. And they brought it in a very, across so many cultures, dialects, ethnicity, and they did it with much boldness and sincerity. Of course, there are people who exploited that for different reasons, but that is to God. So today, Nigeria has so much, a lot of its population that are Bible-believing, Spirit-filled Christians. And on a daily basis, they are very intentional about sharing that gospel of the kingdom all over the country. To the north, to the west, to the south, passionately. I have no doubt in my mind that Christianity is it's on the rise in Nigeria. It's always been more than Islam. That's the truth. And there are those whom God has called to the northern part of Nigeria, where Islam is strong. Now, and there are people who are being converted in the northern part of Nigeria to Christianity. Obviously, there are those also from Islam who don't like that. And that over the decades has brought huge tensions. And when I say huge tensions, this thing started back when my own father was Commissioner of Police of the northeastern states of Nigeria, one of the most notorious places now with Boko Haram. Beautiful place. Being a toddler, being a young man, a young boy, I remember those days. Beautiful place. My father spoke the language frequently, but he was a strong Christian. We didn't have this kind of situation. However, even as back then, you began to see what I would call the silos where the marginalization and the discrimination began. Because what people need to understand is that full-blown, violent, radical persecution starts with discrimination, marginalization. And if you don't stem it then, it becomes what it was. And whilst there were people like myself and many others before me who were saying, Christianity is growing, but there's a major challenge here, it wasn't addressed. And that has now grown into what we now see today. And the spread of the gospel is fantastic in Nigeria, and it continues to be that, but also the persecution is great. Over the decades now, we're challenged. How do we deal with this? I give so much, I thank God for the Christians in those places where every day they leave their homes. They just have to trust God that they come back to their homes and family in one piece. And I ask many of my pastor friends, how do you do it? They encourage us and say, look, this is what we're called to do. There are those who left countries of comfort to come to our country to bring the gospel. Some of them died. And here we are. If this is what God has called us to do, then we'll do it in love and truth.
In 2021, at least 6,000 Christians were martyred for their faith. And the statistic is quite staggering. 8 in 10 of these were Nigerians. 8 in 10. Now, Nigeria is a Commonwealth country. It is a country that should be near and dear to the United Kingdom, and one where we should be very, very definitely challenging persecution where we see it. You just touched on something very clearly, that there are people who every time they gather, every time they meet, they're experiencing some degree of risk for their faith. Is this localized? Is this something that can be identified as a problem in particular hotspots? Is it across the country?
In the early days, when myself and friends of mine used to say that these things are there, even when we were saying Boko Haram exists, people didn't believe us in Nigeria, until we had to put so much international pressure. And then with others, then they were declared a terrorist group. And it's always been there, and it was very prevalent in the North, but we always said it's only a matter of time before we see these things shift in whatever guise or form to other parts of the country. And now it's everywhere. It's come in the form of even kidnappings, and in so many different parts of the country. And so people who thought before, even in Nigeria, that this could not affect them, they're all affected by it. And unfortunately, like I said, we failed to stem this in the silos, and now it's airborne, and it's challenging to deal with it. Having said that, you mentioned something about Nigeria being part of the Commonwealth, and whether countries of the Commonwealth or the UK in their response. In all fairness, I think the UK and certain countries have tried to raise international pressure, but not, in my view, to the extent that they could do. There's so much more that could be done. And I will always say that because I know that the leadership of the country will take pressure coming from the international community on these matters. You recently we hear about the young lady in Sokoto, and you've seen how that again has raised all, is brought into the fore. Even though it's brought into the fore, it's something that happens on a regular basis. You know, again, what is the response we get? We have even seen leaders within our own country who have spoken out, and the moment they get attacked, they shut down, they retract, even from those who are meant to be in government, meant to deal with this. And I said this before, and I say it again: whether it's here in the West in response to these things, or even in Nigeria itself, I will always say that the challenge we have with our political leaders is that we have too many politicians in leadership, but we don't have leadership in politicians. People can really, really stand up and face up to this and deal with it. A country of almost 200 million people in Nigeria, often our own country is sent to other war-torn countries in Africa to help during their wars, like we did in Sierra Leone, and we were commended a lot as the Nigerian army for their contributions there. You want to tell me that we don't have enough to deal with Boko Haram in Nigeria? We do. It's just that there are some powers that be and people that be that need to be called to account that support these situations. And they need to be called to account. I've said this many years ago when the Chibok girls were kidnapped. I said this was Sky News, and I'm still saying it today. There are people in those corridors of power in Nigeria that need to be called to account on some of these things. And it's sad. It's so sad that such a young, bright girl in Sokoto that we've just had, Deborah, can still in today's Nigeria be massacred like that. I must say this though. You will see that there are certain imams in the country that have also come out to condemn the actions and what happened. Some have been bold enough to say it, knowing that it's a risk to their lives, but they've said it anyway, that they condemn it. There are others who tend to say they are more senior. Like I stand to be corrected, but the former vice president of Nigeria, a man called Atiku, and then who I think is standing, if I'm right, for presidency again next year, condemned it on his Twitter page or online. And the moment I hear that he was threatened by his own for vote because of his link to the North, he withdrew it. That tells you a lot.
Tell us a little bit about what actually happened from your perspective, from what you know. I mean, it beggars belief. I was looking at the WhatsApp messages. Deborah Samuel, 19 years old student, passed her exams, was asked how she had passed her exams, and then she gives an answer, and this just spirals out of control. What exactly happened from your perspective?
My perspective is something that I've dealt with, I've heard in the last 20 years. No matter how often it happens, it's horribly, horribly wrong. It's evil. Yes. And I want to say that the perpetrators of this, in my view, more than anything, are psychopaths. They are psychopaths. They're evil to the core. Yes, you look at the ideology behind why they do what they do. You have to, like we will say, expose the ideology, but love the people. But the ideology has to be exposed. And something of young people that we encourage all the time to study together, learn together, you and your colleagues strengthen each other. You are the future of the country. Educate yourself, build your capacity. That's what they were doing. They were doing what we would tell any young community because they are our tomorrow. And that's what they were doing. And then to speak there, to try and bring people in alignment to say, can we focus on why we have a group to help each other and not be distracted? And from there, you are brutally murdered. They are psychopaths, and they need to be called to account, every single one of them. But again, as you begin to look at this, we hear a lot of talk about what's going to happen to those who have done it. And yet, as far as I'm concerned, I'm yet to hear anything of the what's going to happen, the arrest, the people who carried it out. And I always say to the leadership of the nation that if Deborah was the daughter of a member of our own Senate, House of Rep, or minister, or even the president of Nigeria, will we be this? Will this be the response? She's just as important as anybody's daughter in the country. And it's so sad that we're still dealing with this in Nigeria today.
It is indeed tragic. Thank you again to Pastor Ade for your helpful perspective there. We do have quite a few emails and texts. Thank you for your interactions. Joyce, rightfully you highlight that young girls are being kidnapped by these Muslim extremists and raped and forced to marry their captives and convert or be killed. This is a part of life. I mean, you mentioned the case of the schoolgirls, a couple of hundred schoolgirls.
Exactly, it's such a large number. And I think because the numbers were so high and there was school-aged children, it got reported. It was one of the few times that it was reported on the general TV stations. And it raised attention to something which was very serious. But it's like most things, it's up there for a while and then it just gets dropped. But it was a devastating time for those young girls, and it continues to happen. That's the problem. It is continuing to happen in Nigeria, in parts of Africa, and people need to be aware of it.
John says, thank you for highlighting the situation, especially in northern Nigeria. How sad that the media is overlooking or avoiding this. I thoroughly recommend Revelation TV's Gordon Petty's program, absolutely. The Persecuted Church, appreciating tonight's program. Thank God for you all. That's actually from Mary. And then we have this from Anita, following on from that. It's great to see you both. If it wasn't for the Persecuted Church on Revelation TV, I certainly wouldn't have been so aware of the level of persecution going on in countries around the world. We personally pray every day for all those who are being persecuted in these countries. It's so important. I watched the episode about the persecution in Nigeria. It was difficult to watch. I worry about my friend in Burkina Faso. She's converting street children to Christianity. We don't realize how lucky we are. God bless our poor dear brothers and sisters. Sending love and blessings to everyone at Revelation TV. And Anita thanks you for being here tonight and yesterday, and says it's lovely to see you, Alistair. We should pray that we use our religious freedom wisely while we still have it. That's been a point that you've been making throughout this program.
It's one of the things I bang the drum on that one, because as Christians we are people of prayer, and to be aware of what's happening to they are our brothers and sisters. I remind myself, and I have to remind us in the church on a regular basis. Maybe you don't see them because they're a couple of thousand miles, or 5,000 or 7,000 miles away, but in God's eyes and in Jesus' eyes, they are our brothers and sisters, and they're as important as the ones you can see in your own family. And so as believers, it's our duty, but not just a duty, it's a privilege, I would say, rather than a duty, to be able to pray for those who we know are receiving much tougher times than we are. Our times might be tough, but there are those out there. I mean, you're talking about traveling tomorrow to Kurdistan. I have a great friends working in Kurdistan. Amazing things God is doing there. There are people converting to Christianity in the midst of it, but there's a lot of persecution coming against them in the same way, because the whole of that region of the Middle East, the Christians have a tough time. But when they have that encounter with the living God, they are so on fire, and they will not deny their faith, which is tremendous.
Thank you very much for this program. The Fulani herdsmen went to villages in southern Kaduna, killed, burned houses, and people alive. I went to my local church to pray for Nigeria. Some of the members of my church were wondering why they have not heard or seen it on the news here in the UK. I want to thank you very much, and do feel free to share this program with those friends and members of your church. This is a very real concern, I think, that we aren't hearing the honest truth concerning this. We hear a lot of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. We hear a lot of what's going on in China and potential conflicts with Taiwan, where we have economic interests. There's a lot, but as I've already said, Nigeria is a Commonwealth country.
Yes, yeah.
We should actually care. We should actually be presenting some form of challenge, and this should be publicized. I do believe that there has been some expression of grave concern that's been made by various politicians to the president in Nigeria and various others concerned, but there doesn't seem to be nearly the same amount of passion and vigor behind this as in other cases that I feel are arguably less close to home.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And as one or two of the viewers have said, thank God for Revelation TV taking these subjects up, because the mainstream are not handling it at all. I think it's maybe too controversial and they want to have an easy life, but it's so important for us as the believers in on Revelation TV to be informed and to pray, because we are informed and because our hearts are convicted for what we're hearing about and what we're seeing happening all around the world. I mean, we're majoring on Nigeria today, but I could mention many other nations in Africa which have similar situations. And as I say personally, I work in Pakistan, and I've seen the dilemmas that the Christians and the ones that have had their lives taken from them. I mean, there's one incident in one of the churches we actually set up in a village outside of Lahore, where the women used to meet in this compound and pray together during the day, because they were surrounded by Muslims, and they were there with their kids during the daytime, and the Muslims knew about them, and they chucked acid over the walls over these women and these kids. And it's very difficult to get treatment because you're a Christian. You get persecuted even from the hospitals as such. But they were not going to give up their faith. There's no way they were going to deny their Savior, Jesus. And these are things that happen regularly. I'm talking about one incident, but there's so many others that have happened in such countries as Pakistan. Afghanistan is one of the top on the list there of the most dangerous places for Christians. But we need to be aware. We need to be not only praying, but in any way we can encourage those brothers and sisters in those nations that needs it.
As we begin to close this program, let me just summarize and give this perspective. In 2021, around 6,000 Christians were killed for their profession of faith in Jesus Christ. 8 out of 10 of those were Nigerian.
Wow.
8 out of 10.
Huge.
It's very significant.
It's a huge proportion.
So one wonders, okay, we can talk about Afghanistan and North Korea and how if Christians were as open and vocal there, maybe it would be a much more catastrophic loss of life. But Nigeria, in terms of its actual loss of life, ranks higher than any other nation. And yet, the point that you made there, Alistair, if I could just close and remind our viewers, ours is a sure and certain hope. Our Savior was crucified. He suffered so that He might set us an example, even as we suffer. As He picked up His cross, so we pick up our cross and follow Him. We're not looking to have an easy life here. We're looking to the day and time when we will live in a new heaven and new earth of righteousness, which He has promised. The days are evil, the time is short. Our Lord Jesus Christ is coming again. And Alistair, that's our hope.
Absolutely.
That's where it's at.
Absolutely. I mean, we always keep our eyes fixed on the fact that we're eternal beings, and our spiritual realm goes on forever.
This is Behind the Headlines. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for The Lake Show. God bless you.